Tonight, the acting Attorney General, Matt Whitaker, has been sent this letter from the House Judiciary Committee Chairman, Congressman Jerry Nadler of New York. The letter advises Matt Whitaker that at his testimony last week in Congress, quote, members on both sides of the aisle found many of your answers to be unsatisfactory, incomplete, or contradicted by other evidence. Contradicted by other evidence is a bad one. The Judiciary Committee chairman is inviting Matt Whitaker to clarify his testimony, but the implication of his letter, this contradicted by other evidence thing, the implication here is that Matt Whitaker may have made false statements to the committee while he was testifying under oath. To be specific, Nadler says that the committee, quote, has identified several individuals with direct knowledge of the phone calls you denied receiving from the White House about the Justice Department's prosecution of longtime Trump attorney Michael Cohen. Mr. Whitaker said under oath in his testimony that he did not have communications with the White House about the Cohen prosecution. Jerry Nadler has advised him tonight that they have identified several individuals who have direct knowledge of Whitaker, in fact, having phone calls with the White House about that prosecution. If Whitaker gave false testimony under oath, that's going to be a big deal. As far as we know, there's been no response yet from the Justice Department in general or Matthew Whitaker in particular, but it'll be interesting to see how that response goes. It'll be particularly interesting just to see if Mr. Whitaker tries to evade congressional oversight on this by virtue of the fact that he's about to be no longer a Justice Department employee. Because as if there weren't enough going on today, tomorrow the Senate is expected to vote on a new attorney general to replace Matt Whitaker. William Barr is on track to win confirmation from the Republican-controlled Senate as the new head of the Department of Justice. In his confirmation hearing last month, of course, Mr. Barr was notably indirect and noncommittal on what he would do with any findings from special counsel Robert Mueller in his investigation. Barr said he could not say whether he would make any of those findings public or even let Congress see them. Across the Capitol in the U.S. House, however, the Democratic majority there has suggested that there may be some remedies for Congress and maybe even the public getting access to what Robert Mueller finds in his investigation. The House Intelligence Chair, Adam Schiff, says, yes, he pretty much is willing to subpoena any Mueller report if there is one and if need be. I also have questions as to whether the chairman believes it would be possible to get testimony from Robert Mueller about any of his findings in his investigation, separate and apart from any report that Mueller may provide to William Barr or whoever's the next AG. Joining us now is Congressman Adam Schiff. He's the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Mr. Chairman, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
There's a lot going on. I have a ton of things I want to ask you about tonight. But I actually like to ask you first about this sort of breaking news that we're following tonight, this ruling from the judge in the Paul Manafort case, ruling that Mr. Manafort intentionally lied to prosecutors after he had agreed to cooperate with them. As both the chair of the Intelligence Committee and as a former prosecutor yourself, I just wanted to ask you your sense of how important this ruling is.
Well, it's going to be devastating to Manafort. He's going to get none of the benefit of the plea agreement, and I think he's likely to have the judge throw the book at him. I mean, look, this is someone who, after he's arrested, while he's being tried, is found to be witness tampering. And then he agrees to cooperate, and he's found to be lying. I mean, it's hard to have a record more appalling than that to the judge. What I also think is significant is it appears the judge has largely agreed with what the special counsel argued, and that is not only did he lie, but the motivation here is if he told the truth about his relationship with someone affiliated with Russian intelligence while he was the campaign chairman, that would be so damaging effectively to Trump that it would negate his chance of a pardon. That, to me, is quite telling. It's not just that if he told the truth, it would be damaging to Manafort or Kilimnik, but it would reflect so adversely on the president that he would lose his chance of a pardon. And there's obviously more to that when we find out about those meetings with Kilimnik.
Are you worried? I mean, one of the things the prosecutors suggested here is that one thing that might explain some of Mr. Manafort's behavior, including when it comes to his interactions with prosecutors, is that he might have been angling for a pardon from President Trump. Now that Mr. Manafort's case appears to have come to this crashing end, as you say, it looks like the judge has no reason not to absolutely throw the book at him. Are you expecting or concerned? Do you have any thoughts on the prospect that this is the moment at which the president might feel most inclined to talk about a pardon when it comes to Manafort?
It certainly is a concern, because if there was ever a president to abuse the pardon power, it's likely to be this one. I think Manafort was trying to play it both ways. He wanted to angle for a pardon with the president. At the same time, he knew he could get stiffed by the president because the president, after all, doesn't care about Manafort or anyone else. He cares about Donald Trump. And so he wanted at the same time to try to minimize his sentence and reduce his exposure there and still hold out the prospect of a pardon. But he, I think, clearly felt that he couldn't maintain any possibility of a pardon if he was honest about what kind of a relationship the campaign had through him with this Russian intelligence-linked individual.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you to stay while we have a quick break. There's a couple of other matters that arose in today's news and that are going to be important tomorrow. I'd like to ask you about if you can stick with us.
Absolutely.
All right. Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff, joins us again when we come back. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.